So yesterday we started knowing about Spring MVC, how servlets are helping in terms of sending request from front end to back end that we learned, particularly in Spring MVC, between our front end and back end, between front end implementation and the back end implementation, there is a controller. That controller is helping us to exchange the front end request to back end. The servlet class name is dispatcher servlet, right? All the front end requests will come to this dispatcher servlet. We generally call this dispatcher servlet as a front controller. In general, any application, any web application, right? Or you can remember this for REST based application also. In a web or REST based application in Spring, you may get request from a web client. So you may have registration form from a Chrome browser, something from Mumbai, one client calling from Chrome browser from some location, and one calling list of employees form, employee list form from Hyderabad from his mobile device, maybe a REST based one. And I have a one more form, login, somewhere from US, happening from iPhone. Any device, any kind of form which is implemented for your application, accessing from multiple locations, from multiple devices, from desktops, from mobile phones, iPhone devices, Android devices, whatever it is. As soon as you submit your request from front end, the request straight away it will come to your server. In general, it will come to your server, Tomcat. Once Tomcat receives this request, once it receives the request, it will send this request to dispatcher servlet first. You need to have a dispatcher servlet in your application. So all your requests need to map to this dispatcher servlet, DS. Okay, I'm using shorthand name DS, means dispatcher servlet. So all requests should come to dispatcher servlet first. In such a way, you need to configure your web.xml file, right? How forms will map to this dispatcher servlet in web.xml file, you need to configure. In mapping file, you need to configure such a way. In web.xml, when you configure URL patterns, right? When you configure URL pattern like star URL pattern, and you can map this to dispatcher server with URL pattern star dot star. When you configure it, all front-end requests can able to map to your dispatcher servlet. Okay, this is very important during configuration, right? This is very important that you need to do first. First, you need to map all your front-end requests to dispatcher servlet. So only one servlet, if it is configured for all the forms, for all the front-end requests and responses, will go via dispatcher servlet only. So if you configure any such servlet or filters here, we can call them as front controllers. Basically, this design pattern Name itself is a front controller design pattern. Mapping many forms or all the application forms to one controller first is called front controller design pattern. This design pattern is front controller design pattern. This is front controller design pattern. As per front controller design pattern, all the front end forms need to map to one single servlet. One single servlet. So then we can call it as front controller. What is the front controller here for us? Dispatcher servlet. Who stands first before your backend code? Dispatcher servlet. So that's why we are calling it as front controller. Every request will come to this front controller first. From here, it will dispatch to your backend coding. For each form, you would be having a specific logic. For registration form, you will be writing registration related logic. For simple registration form, you might have simple registration logic. For list form, you might have some get operations to list all the employees. And for login, you may have different logic here. Username, passwords, and validations. So each form is having a separate business requirement. Each form is having a separate business requirement. Registration is having one kind of requirement, list is having one kind of requirement, login is having one requirement. So for each business requirement, you need to have a separate controller for each business requirement. For each business requirement, you can have a separate controller class. Can't I club all this into one controller? You can do that, but that is not a good practice. As per solid principles, right? You should give single responsibility to each Java class. Single responsibility. You should not put so many responsibilities. Keeping so many responsibilities will make that class tightly coupled or not easy to maintain. In many terms, that is not a recommended, practice. Not a recommended practice. So for each business requirement, implement a separate controller. So as I have registration form here, I can have a registration controller. And for employee list, to show the list of employees, I can have a separate controller. Employee list controller or employee controller. And I have a login requirement. For that one, I have a different controller class here. Login controller. So here, dispatcher servlet also a controller. It is also a controller, but it is a front controller. It is a front controller. It will not handle any of your business requirements. It will not handle any of your business requirement. I have a registration. So will it do registration for you? Dispatcher servlet will store data into database by reading your name, email address. No, it will never do. And when you have list of employees, will dispatcher servlet will connect with database and bring list of employees for you? No, it will never do that. And when you have login, username, password verification, will it do? No, nothing. Dispatcher servlet job is just it will dispatch your request. In the name itself, as we have dispatch, just to dispatch. What it need to dispatch? Request. When you submit your request from any form, first it will receive the request and it will redirect to your specific controllers. Why we need this dispatcher servlet? Directly can't I map to controller? No. If you design in such a way, if every form individually, if it is connecting with your controllers, there is no central request handling. Centralized request handling is not applicable for your application. If there is no centralized request handling, what will happen? Managing security, other common requirements will become difficult. Instead of having a front controller here, straight away if I map my form to registration controller and list to employee controller and login to login controller. If I do individual mapping independently without any mediator between, what will happen? Handling security kind of operations will become difficult. So, like when you have a main door for your home, right? So everybody will enter through the main door. Then you will have different doors for different bedrooms and kitchens and bathrooms. We'll have different accesses from there. But the main access is our main door. So for any of Spring MVC based web application or REST based application, the first main access is dispatcher servlet only. First they should come to the dispatcher servlet. There we can apply all the security related stuff. We can apply key and all. So they will be verified first, authentication and authorization. All such we can apply in this place. Then if everything is good, then you can say go ahead. Dispatcher servlet will say go ahead to the controller. So your requirement specific controller you can execute here. Your requirement specific controller you can execute. For registration form, registration controller, employee list, employee controller, login, login. From here, how dispatcher servlet will recognize for this registration business requirement, there is a registration controller I need to execute that. How dispatcher servlet can identify that? There are two ways. Earlier, we used to do configurations via XML file to identify that. I got a request till here, registration form. Then how dispatcher servlet will recognize I should only execute registration controller. One is via XML file. Either you should do it in XML file, mapping. You need to use Spring XML file. There you need to do mapping. Form to controller. Your form to controller mapping you need to do via Spring XML file. Via your Spring XML file you need to do this. This is one approach. This is one way. The other way is directly inside controller itself, under controller class itself, you can mention actions here. Request mappings. Via annotation, we can give request mappings here. We can give request mappings here. Either via XML file or via request mapping. Here you can put your action here. If it is a registration like that. Two ways. One is via XML file and one is via request mapping. In two ways, we can map front-end request to back-end requirement specific controller via your dispatcher servlet. So what dispatcher servlet will do in general, if it is a XML approach, dispatcher servlet will load this XML into IOC. Via IOC, it will read all your configuration. In XML file, what we will have? Either we do bean configuration or we apply component scan. Via bean configuration or via component scan, all your beans, whatever you write from here, right side section. All your beans, your controller classes, service classes, DOO classes, whatever you write here after. All this right side part. All these classes will be loaded into IOC here. And all your beans available to dispatcher servlet. So which bean is important for dispatcher servlet? Dispatcher servlet got a request from front end. It need to map to controller. So from this IOC configuration via XML file, it will read is there any bean containing particular action for this registration form. Is there any bean containing action? It will verify. If there is any bean configured here, then that bean will be executed via XML file or via annotation. If there is no XML configuration, at least it will read your request mappings. It will read all your request mappings. Then it will understand, okay, for this particular request mapping, there is a controller. So then that particular controller it will execute. There are two ways. One is via XML file or via annotations also we can map. So this front controller will do what? It will map your request to so and so controller, which means as soon as you receive request from your front end form, dispatcher servlet will receive the request from your front end. Then dispatcher servlet from here it will send it to your backend classes. Okay, backend is a combination of many classes, right? That we have implemented so far using Spring. So here you will be having controller for each form. Controller, service, DAO. You will be writing for every requirement, right? For every requirement, you will be writing specific
Sir, one
request here.
question. Second XML, is it for dispatcher servlet or IOC container, sir?
Yeah, let me finish with it. Okay, keep your questions. Okay, once we're done with the discussion, we can have. Okay, so you will be having all the backend classes here, all the backend classes which we implement for our requirement, right? Front end we will be having here controllers. Okay, it is very small. Let me increase it. Controller, service, DAOs. So for every particular requirement, you will be having a controller, service, DAOs. Okay, consider you have an employee registration. For that one, you have a different set of controller, service, DAOs you have, and for login form, you have a different controller, service, DAOs you have. So when there is a request here, let's say my action is REG. My action is form action is REG registration. For this one, I want to execute this controller and this service, this DAO. But all these are backend classes which are implemented using Spring. Spring modules I have used so far. Whatever Spring XYZ modules I have used. Spring modules I have used to implement it. All these classes are Spring classes. Right? Controller, service, DAO classes, whichever I implement, all that classes are Spring classes. Spring beans. In other words, we can say all these are Spring beans. Spring beans. Pozo classes. We know that who will create Pozo classes object? IOC will create either via component scanning, or if you configure this class into XML file via bean tag also, it will create object for you. Okay, so dispatcher servlet will be calling your IOC during dispatcher servlet initialization. If you know init method, right, in servlets, during this dispatcher servlet object creation, not only dispatcher servlet object, dispatcher will start your IOC container also. IOC container. It will start your IOC container. What it will do, IOC container? It will load all your classes, controllers, services, DAOs, all that objects it will create. All your objects it will create. So your controller objects, service objects, DAO objects will be registered here. All your backend class, as I have 9 classes there, all the 9 classes objects it will create. Who holds all your objects? IOC container. All your backend classes will be loaded into IOC. All your backend classes will be loaded into IOC. But in general, how we are starting IOC? Just by loading XML file, right? Application context AP equal to new class path XML application context, and we are loading XML file. Who do that job? Inside dispatcher servlet, we have the similar logic. Inside dispatcher servlet, we have the similar logic to start IOC container. And basically, which implementation is using here is web application context, which is different from application context and bean factory. So web application context container is your IOC container in web applications. So what is the job of web application context here? First, it will create all your objects, controller, service, DAOs, and it will do all the dependency injections. Wherever dependency injections are required, wherever objects creation is required, everything it will do first. Okay, so hereafter your front-end objects are ready, front-end forms are ready, dispatcher servlet object is ready, and dispatcher servlet is started IOC also. So all your back-end objects also ready. Now if I submit a request, client came, user wanted to do the registration. Now he started using registration form. As soon as he submitted his data, as soon as he submitted data, something, Ravi, he wants to register it. So he entered some data and submitted it. The data request will come to dispatcher servlet first. Then dispatcher servlet will try to identify controller. It will receive the request. Then it will start looking for controller. How it will identify the controller? Via your XML file mapping, or if your controller contains annotation with this action. This action need to be mapped. Whatever action I have here, this action need to map to my controller. If this is the controller need to be executed for this action, it have to configure via request mapping of, this is very important because in microservices or in annotations case we use the same annotation. So here you should map a request mapping with the registration action. So as these all beans are created here, right? Your controller beans and service beans, everything. So this controller bean also available here in this IOC. Then dispatcher servlet will ask a handler mapping class. There is a helper class for this dispatcher servlet. We call it as handler mapping. So dispatcher servlet will ask handler mapping class about controller. It will ask dispatcher servlet as soon as it receives request. First step it will receive the request. As soon as it gets the request, it will ask handler mapping. It will ask handler mapping. A handler mapping. I got a request like slash registration. I got a request like slash registration. What is the controller for that action? It will ask handler map. Then handler mapping will try to identify it via annotations, or is there in a bean configured via bean name. Yesterday, if you remember, we configured controller with the bean name also. If it is a XML approach, if you are not using annotations, right, you can use bean name. Inside name, you can put URL here. If you remember, we have never used bean name before. Only for controllers we are using bean name. You can consider here, you can put here URL of your front end request and put your class name here, your controller class name. If it is a XML based approach, you will be doing it here with the bean name. Two ways, right? One is via XML approach, and one is via annotation approach. So handler mapping will check whether you are using XML based mapping or annotation based mapping. Anyone is fine. So either via this bean name or via this request mapping. Two ways you have. Forget about the programmatic approach. This is nowhere we are using it nowadays. This is very old concept. Okay, but earlier we used to do that. So handler mapping will identify the controller via request mapping. It will check which request where this request mapping slash registration is mapped. Slash registration is mapped to a so and so controller. So it will read that controller name. It will read that controller name and it will say to dispatcher servlet, hey dispatcher servlet, there is a controller with that particular request. When I erase it, why it is happening? Something need to be changed. Okay. Yeah. So when there is a request from form, dispatcher servlet will ask handler mapping class which controller I should execute. I have here, if you see via IOC, right? It is having three controller objects, and from here it is having service objects and DAO objects also. Once it identifies the controller, controllers will identify services, services will identify DAOs via auto wiring. That's not a big deal. So dispatcher servlet will ask handler mapping which controller I should execute. So then handler mapping will say there is so and so object that you have to use. Then dispatcher servlet will get that object from here. When it suggests a name, let's say there is a registration controller, get that registration controller object. Then dispatcher servlet will get that registration controller object and it will forward the request to controller. It will forward your request to controller. It will forward your request to controller. Then from there, as usual, via auto wiring, the remaining mapping is done via auto wiring. Services are already auto wired into controller, so they can execute. And services are auto wired into DAO, so they also can execute. We are very clear on that auto wiring based mapping and how we can able to call from one class to another class. Backend part is clear. So as soon as I receive request to dispatcher servlet will ask handler mapping for which controller need to be executed. Then handler mapping will give the so and so controller is eligible for it, execute it. It will say to dispatcher servlet. Then dispatcher servlet will collect your object and it will send the same request to your particular controller. Then controller will talk with service will talk with DAOs will do all the CRUD operations. And once everything is done, it need to send response back. Usually the response it is sending in the form of the response it will send finally, right? So from here after third step, fourth, fifth, we are clear. Then coming to sixth step. Once a response coming from controller to dispatcher servlet, right? Your controller will send response back to dispatcher servlet. but not a plain response we are sending. We are sending response in the form of model and view. If you see the class which we implemented yesterday, we are sending response finally in the form of model and view. Model and view is a combination of model and view, MAV, M-A-V, model and view. Model and view is a combination of a response object and as well as view name. Model and view. Model and view. So model and view is a combination of your response body as well as view name or request body you can say. So model is a request body. Model you can consider like a request body, exactly request body. Model object is a request. So request holds request body. So model holds request object like request scope object. So your model contains the request scope data. And what about this view? View holds your view name only. Model holds request object, view holds only view name. So once the response is submitted from controller to dispatcher servlet back in the form of model and view, dispatcher servlet not aware of this view. Just you will be giving simple view name about the location and what kind of page it is, JSP or HTML or velocity, or we may have different kind of or JavaScript page. Don't know which page it need to pick up and should redirect as a response to client. So once it is getting model and view response back to dispatcher servlet, what it will do? It will convert your model to, it will put your model data into request scope. It will keep your data into request scope before sending response. And it will try to identify the view. To identify the view, we need one more helper class here. One more helper class is here for dispatcher servlet is view resolver. View resolver. So it will ask view resolver class. It will ask view resolver class. I got only view name. Can you help me to identify what is the location of that view and what is the extension of that view? It will ask view resolver. Then view resolver will help here. The seventh step, view resolver will help to identify the view page location and extension. You're giving only response view name. What about location? And is it JSP page or HTML page extension? So view resolver will provide the location of your output page and as well as extension of your output page. These two inputs view resolver bean is having. So it will ask view resolver bean, please give me location and extension of views. So then it will suggest so and so location in so and so location with so and so extension, you have that page. Go and get it. Then dispatcher servlet will get that and it will put that page into response dot send redirect. It will use response dot send redirect. Send redirect. It will pass the complete path here. Response dot send redirect complete path. You know what it will do. Response dot send redirect when we put, immediately it will redirect that page to front end. Bus. Finally, the user will be receiving response back. Whoever is requested, he will be receiving response back finally. On the step 8. Using response dot send redirect mechanism, it will get the response. So this is how end-to-end flow will be happen. Okay, once again I'll repeat. As soon as client request from the front end, from the front end, right? First request will go to dispatcher servlet. This is your front controller. Dispatcher servlet immediately will ask handler mapping, what is the controller that I should execute. Then handler mapping will identify via XML based mapping or annotation based mapping. Okay, remember annotation based mapping. So in annotations we configured request mapping. Under that request mapping we configure URL or action of the form. So whichever bean contained that request mapping which is there in your form, it will identify that particular bean or controller class and it will give that name to dispatcher servlet. Then dispatcher servlet will get that controller bean from IOC. Will get that controller bean from IOC. Obviously, you need all these backend objects, but you are not creating that objects. Who do it for you? IOC will do it for you. IOC will be ready with all these objects and it will ask dispatcher servlet, what do you want? Dispatcher servlet will say, I need so and so controller. Can you please give it to me? Yes, take it. IOC will give that object to dispatcher servlet. Then dispatcher servlet will pass data to your object. Whatever request responses it is having, it will pass your data to your controller. Then controller will forward to service, service will send to DM. Their CRUD operation will be completed. Then finally you should send response back. While sending response, you need to compose your response into model and view. What is the need of model? If you want to put some data for the front end, you can hold that data into model. And whatever view you want to send as a response, that you can put it into view object, to only view name only. Model object is a map object. Under view, you can configure simple view name only while sending it. So finally, I am sending my model and view object to dispatcher servlet. I am sending my model and view response to dispatcher servlet. Then dispatcher servlet will ask view resolver, hey view resolver, I got your model data, it will keep it into request scope. That is fine. And to do response dot send redirect complete page path, it doesn't know. It don't know about your complete page path. So it will ask view resolver. View resolver, can you please help me to identify that path? Yes, I'll give you path. What else you want? And what about the page extension? Is it a JSP or HTML? It will say that extension as well. Both location and extensions will be provided by view resolver to dispatcher servlet so that comfortably it will redirect your response back to front end. This is how end-to-end mapping will be done. So here we used two kind of mapping files. One mapping file is to map your front-end request to dispatcher servlet, which is web.xml file, and other file is to load all your backend classes, right? To load all your backend classes, handler mappings, view resolvers. Okay. These beans also will be created by these beans also, right? Your handler mapping bean and view resolver beans also will be created in IOC only. Here only your handler mapping object and view resolver also will be created. Handler mapping and view resolver objects also your IOC only will give to dispatcher servlet. So don't think that handler mapping view resolver objects are created by dispatcher servlet. Handler mapping bean and view resolver bean also created by IOC only. So IOC only will create them. Basically you need to configure them. So these two objects will help dispatcher servlet to identify the location of your controller, to identify the output page location of your response. So to load all your handler mappings, view resolvers, backend classes, we need one more file, which is your Spring XML file. One more XML file we will be having. There we have all the Spring configurations. So you will be having Spring XML files, or you may name it IOC XML. Your IOC XML file. In this IOC XML file, we will configure all these beans, handler mapping, view resolvers, and all backend classes. In this web.xml file, we will configure dispatcher servlet class. No class is missed. Every class need to be created. Object need to be created. Dispatcher servlet object is created via web.xml and created by whom? Tomcat. Dispatcher servlet object created by Tomcat. Let me underline this with different colors. So dispatcher servlet object will be created. Dispatcher servlet object will be created by Tomcat. Tomcat will create for it. And all the remaining classes from handler mapping class, this one, view resolver object, all your controller objects, service class objects, and your DAOs all will be created by your IOC container. And only dispatcher servlet created by this class only created by Tomcat. That's why Tomcat is mandatory. Though we able to manage all the classes, your application may have 1 lakh plus 1 classes. 1 lakh plus 1 classes you can have. All 1 lakh objects will be created by IOC. But the one class dispatcher servlet is managed by Tomcat. Without Tomcat, we can't imagine this dispatcher servlet. So dispatcher servlet must be initialized by a Tomcat because Tomcat wanted to exchange information to servlet only. So you need to have such a servlet. But do you need to implement it on your own means? Nothing. Not required. Spring MVC given this dispatcher servlet, use it. It is very comfortable class. Just to configure it in web.xml file. And as soon as you configured it as a front controller, all your front end requests will come to dispatcher servlet only. And dispatcher servlet is having a mechanism internally to load your IOC XML file into web application context. So as soon as you load your IOC XML file into web application context, it will create all your beans, which means handler mapping, view resolver, controller, services, DOs. Then dispatcher servlet, for every request it will ask handler mapping to get to know about the controller. Handler mapping will suggest which is the you know uh, a particular controller for your action. Then from there, dispatcher servlet will send the request to controllers and flow will happen. Finally, when you send response back, it will use view resolvers to send the response back. Simple. So, what was your question?
So we did examples, right, sir? We created container and container created objects from XML.
Hmm.
So when dispatcher servlets gets when it gets to dispatcher, dispatcher will in its method it will load the IOC container,
Correct.
and second XML will get passed there, sir.
Correct. Second XML means your Spring
So
XML.
which XML, sir?
Spring.
Okay, Spring XML. Okay, in that Spring XML we have bean names like view resolver, handler mapping also.
Uh, yeah, by default, view resolver we configured, right? You see, isn't it a bean? View resolver bean. We configured it, correct? And
Correct.
by default, bean name URL handler mapping, though you didn't configure it also, one bean object will be created. That is bean name URL handler mapping. This bean object will be created by default. Bean name URL handler mapping. In this bean name itself, you can identify, you can see the name. Whichever bean is having name URL, bean name as a URL. So bean name as a URL we should use while using this bean name URL handler mapping class. So this object also created. This is handler mapping class. As I was saying, this is the handler mapping, and this is your view resolver. This one is your view resolver VM. This is your view resolver class. This is your handler mapping class, and the dispatcher servlet is your front controller class. This is your TS front controller. Okay. Yeah. Apart from these two, all
In
other
that,
beans you will be configuring here.
sir, once it is done, created, these beans, then the request flows, right?
Exactly. First, all the beans need to be initialized first.
So the in the init method, it will create all the beans for the servlet classes, and also
No, 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 no.
uh,
Dispatcher servlet is already created by Tomcat. This is not in our hands. This is done by Tomcat. When you start your Tomcat, dispatcher servlet object will be initialized,
okay, okay.
or at the time of
Then
first user
this,
request, whatever it is. Dispatcher servlet
so,
object
yeah,
will start along with the dispatcher servlet. It will start IOC. Dispatcher servlet will start IOC.
yes, sir. When we start Tomcat, dispatcher servlet bean will be created. Sorry, object will be created in which is a servlet. Right, servlet and init method will be executed. IOC container code will be in that init method,
Okay.
and that will look at the XML and will create all the servlet beans,
Not
and
servlets. Don't
also
call them servlets. They all are beans. Spring beans.
spring beans.
All are
Okay,
spring beans. Handler mapping, view resolver, controller, service, DAOs. All these objects will be created by IOC. IOC
okay,
cannot able
okay.
to create servlet object. Nothing to do with servlet object. IOC will use pure beans, simple beans. In the first discussion itself, I said simple POSO classes are sufficient for you. So all your beans are managed by IOC only, except dispatcher servlet.
The IOC container contains application context, web application context, configurable context, right? So what does actually web application context or configurable context or application context? It will try to download, it will try to load the controller and service classes, or it will try to load the controller classes.
Everything.
Uh,
This web application context will load all your classes. Don't try to differentiate them. All are same. Just in web application context given for the web application implementation for the request scope, response scope, session scope, such a things. Okay, but don't look depth into web application context. Just focus on the architecture. Okay, they don't give you any much differences. It is similar to your
Sir,
application context only.
sir, when it creates spring beans, it will look at the tag bean and it will look at the class and it will create, right? Once everything is created, a request comes to dispatcher servlet. It will invoke that handler mapping bean,
Hmm.
which tells controller which controller to use, and then the pipeline happens, service DAO,
Hmm.
and request comes back to again dispatcher servlet, right?
Correct.
Then dispatcher servlet will call view resolver servlet bin,
Hmm.
spring bin,
Yeah,
and it will give view. And how does model get into that view?
that's a simple request scope. As I said, right? Your model will be kept into request scope. If you are aware of request scope, then it will be easy to. Your model will be loaded into request scope. That's why we are doing here, right? Request dot get attribute. Basically, if you look at into your controller, I'm creating one map object. You know, right? Map will have key
Sir,
and
I'm
value.
not seeing. Uh, are you showing something, sir?
Yeah, is my screen visible to everyone?
Yeah, yeah. No, yeah.
So here we created a map object with key value pair. We are putting key and the value here. You should assume this like a request scope. Generally in servlets we learned request to dot set attribute. This is how we set. So this is equivalent to this. Above two lines are equivalent to this. Above two lines are equivalent to this. Okay. As a model and view, you should send it. Okay. How you will read it? So when you do it, it is like a request dot set attribute of key. Wherever you need request dot get attribute, you need to use. That is like a simple bean.
Sir, uh, can you please upload the yesterday example? Actually, I'm not able to see on the link.
Yeah. Example not uploaded. Just video is there. Yeah, I'll do that. So here we are calling request dot get attribute of message. So it is giving your message back, and you are consuming it.
So, sir, it's one thing is it is not a response. Huh? It is not in the response object.
Scope, not the response will be used for sender redirect such operations.
Hello,
Response
sir.
doesn't have any scope. In request scope only we will put data to forward. There is no such a response dot set attribute. We never do that. Response object we use for send redirect operations or get write operations.
So in code we didn't use response object at all.
No.
In the code you showed.
No. We have not used any response object, but that response object is required to dispatch a server. In case if you have any response related things, right? You want to set it, you need to use this. Otherwise, this object is not required for you.
So here, when we set attribute, right, message key, it's like a servlet request set attribute. You are creating map object, and key is whatever. How do we know which key to use?
It's up to you. Which key you want to put here key and use that same key to read here. It's up to you. Put A and use the A key only here. Put XYZ there, then put XYZ here. It's a key value pair. You give a key for your data and fetch that same data by using the same key. And my key holds a strings information, so that's why I read string here. If my key contains list, I can read list here. If my string contains bean, I can read bean here. If my key contains bean, anything I can put it into request scope, not a simple string message. You can hold 1,000 list objects, 1,000 map objects.
But it will be,
yeah.
But it will be accessed using get attribute on key of that
exactly
map.
Exactly. Yeah. So any questions, others?
Yes, sir. Can you go to the
examples?
Hello.
Yeah, you are.
Yes. Can you go to the architecture?
I didn't get you. Deepali, you want?
Yes, sir. Yes. In which step IOC will get the object? Means you have mentioned the first step is
during
request content controller.
During the startup itself, your dispatcher servlet. Let's see. Okay, let's see source code of dispatcher servlet. Generally, I don't have access here. Okay, dispatcher servlet source code. Okay, so Spring project libraries we have here. So this is the dispatcher servlet class actually. Dispatcher servlet class implemented from framework servlet, maybe in its parent class. or search for web application context. Web application context. Web application context initializer, HTTP servlet request, jump to okay, this is a simple class. Context. Exactly, if you want to know which line where it is initializing, you can debug more depth into it. Okay. Delegating proxy filter. Faces context utils under web framework servlet. Okay. So framework servlet is the parent class for dispatcher servlet. Just a parent. In this parent class, we have this web application context reference. So is it initializing here? That you need to check. Control F. Web application context.
Sir, what's the shortcut, sir? Control O or Control K?
This is a browser. Control F. Control find. If it is a Mac, I don't know. Control F. So here you can see private boolean web application context. Go depth into it. Framework servlet constructor getting web application context object, which means somebody initializing it and passing this object. I can see new class, new servlet context, servlet context refresh listener, configure application context. So again, go back to your dispatcher servlet one. Somebody initializing, right? Initializing framework servlet and passing.
Sir, this is not looking like servlet code at all, right? In it,
Servlet only.
maybe
Servlet with so much
maybe
extended logic. Servlet only. Servlet only. It is having so much framework logic. Huh?
Once go to that base class, sir. Once click on the
Framework servlet. Framework servlet.
Can we click a control, sir, in the GitHub, like an IDE? Control click will take to the parent class.
What is that? Control?
Usually in IDE we control click, right, sir?
No, it is not IDE. I am in web browser actually. I am referring Spring document. I mean classes. Application context initializer listener. Web application context object is injected into your constructor actually. So this is how it is getting the object. Maybe context listener factory somewhere. A listener or somewhere it is initializing. So in which all places we have this one web application context in context Spring framework, Spring web source main Java Spring web context support context exposing HTTP request field method. This is Java JSF web JSF faces. This is field. Explore it. Okay, if you want to know exactly what it is, explore it more. But what I would say is init method will initialize it. If not,
Sir, one last attempt, sir. Once go there. That servlet code. So close it and what is the first class we found?
dispatcher servlet.
Dispatcher servlet class. Yeah, go there, sir. Go to the class in the top it framework servlet, right? So even framework servlet is extending some other class, right? Maybe we need to check that base class.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Something.
Yeah, that's how we need to explore and find it.
Sir, oh, there it is, sir. Definitions extends HTTP servlet, right side. Class framework servlet. I don't know how you got there, but
It's saved. It is showing. Yeah. So framework servlet is extending HTTP servlet. End of the day, they are servlets. Okay.
that's the class we use in advanced, right? Advanced Java HTTP servlet.
Yeah. Class function, framework servlet. All the references also it is showing. See how cool it is. So framework servlet constructor is calling.
From servlet, the first base class is generic servlet.
Sir, search for HTTP servlet, sir, and we'll find it.
No, it is there now
HTTP
already.
servlet.
Didn't you see?
Where? Init method?
You want to see the method of it.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, HTTP servlet init method.
Guys, explore it and let me know tomorrow, okay? Now it will take lot of time here.
Okay.
So you see, check it, this documentation. Maybe go to GitHub Spring projects. There you can find it, okay? Let me share this URL link to you.
Sir, can you? This is the last question. Please go to the architecture. Can I consider the fourth step, that is the means IOC container will create the object of all controller service and earlier? Means as you mentioned, the first step is then dispatcher servlet
No.
create
Object
goes the
creation will happen at 0 and 0.1. You can say this will happen first itself. So consider 0.1.
Okay.
First
Yes,
dispatcher servlet object. Next step 0.2 IOC object. First itself they will initialize and wait. If you configure dispatcher servlet as a eager servlet, right? It will initialize beginning of your Tomcat
okay.
itself. You start Tomcat start dispatcher, dispatcher start web application context, and they will sit idle
Okay.
until your request.
Okay. Okay.
Got it?
Yeah, got it. Yeah.
Sir, one last question. Response object we never use in code, right?
Never means it's up to you. If you have any requirement, you can use response dot send a redirect mechanisms we use. Response object mainly for send redirects, forwards. But not in Spring MVC, okay? In Spring, we don't much use request or response objects. Okay? In servlets, you can see that more about request and responses. Here, not even this request object also. Going forward, right? You never see request object as well. Only my requirement to this controller is I need data which is coming from here. I don't want worry about what is request, what is response objects also. I don't want even go into the terminology. Just here I have data, that data I want here. That's how we need to implement these controllers without request and response as well. Okay. In core programming, we used to use them.